Gran Turismo 4 has just turned 20, or at least here in Europe. It was released back when game devs still made us here on the old continent wait an arbitrary extra amount of time for each release. And to this day it's widely considered as one of the best in the franchise and one of the most fondly remembered racing games of all time. So what better opportunity to see if it truly stands the test of time than in this 20-year retrospective. You ready? Good. Let's begin with probably the most bombastic, over-the-top and pretentious intro to any racing game ever made. And if you remember Panama by Van Halen playing after that instead, just remember that it was back in when games could have different music depending on which region they're released in. After that, you're dumped into the very iconic main menu, where instead of just giving you a list, you're given this interactive map where you can just hover over these various icons. It's an interesting approach, I'll give them that, and definitely more exciting than just a menu of text. However, at first it can get difficult to remember where everything is and get around it, especially because you don't have a full view of the entire map. Obviously, one of the main things to do here is accessing the huge amount of races that this game has, given how many events there are for you to partake in, set across the 51 included tracks. And this is what makes Gran Turismo 4 Gran Turismo 4. The fact that despite its age, they managed to fit so much content into such an old game. And it ends up having way much more variety than most modern racing games, which is kind of sad. You have a lot of normal events and you slowly do make your way from simple weekend cups where you drive non-modified stock cars you'd buy on a shoestring budget in the early aughts, all the way up to the most important races and of course the final championship. But it gets a lot more specific than that, like events for cars from certain decades. Or hey, do you want to enter a cup just for VW Lupos? You go for that, because that's an option for some reason. Yes, it gets that specific, but it also goes beyond that, given how there's also rally stages. You have the expected ones like tight European city streets, snow, dirt, road going into dirt for that extra spice, and even wet tracks, which are a bit of a joke. Not only is there just a single track for this race type, but you can easily win against even the fastest cars in the game if you just overtake them in the first two corners. While there are neat distractions, definitely not the deepest rally game ever made, and there is one very annoying aspect to them, that being the penalty system, where if the front of your car ever bumps into your opponent, or the barriers on the side of the road, you get given a 5-second penalty where your car is slowed down. And especially if you don't have too much control of your car, like in the dirt or snow stages, it can be pretty impossible to avoid. But probably the biggest scam is the fact that your opponent is always immune to it, and they can bash into you as much as they want without any consequence, because in this world the referees are corrupt as well. Thankfully none of that translates over to the main races, and as you can imagine, the racing model itself is pretty stiff and realistic, or at least that's what I've been told. I don't really drive in real life, so I have no idea how realistic this actually is. Even then, the realism has its limits though, given how collisions are kind of weird in this game. There is no collision damage whatsoever, and more than anything, the cars just kind of bounce off of each other. Now I get that when we have a game with so many licensed cars, obviously these companies don't want to see their vehicles being mangled and damaged. At the same time, it makes it kind of weird that there is no penalty for messing up this much, especially in a game that is so unforgiving 99% of the time. It can be extremely difficult, and if you incorrectly do one corner and drive onto the sand, well, you pretty much have to restart. But then you're given a complete free pass when it comes to crashing your cars at a speed that should, by all accounts, decapitate you. As I mentioned earlier, it can be unforgiving, especially given how there is no difficulty settings, so you just have to have the fastest car and not mess up even once. But it also works the other way. If you show up to an event in a completely overpowered car, the opponents won't scale. However, if it's too much for you, there's always some other things you can do. You can exploit the ping-pong collision physics I mentioned earlier, because in many instances, it's literally better to not brake and just bounce off the walls or bounce off other cars instead to get an advantage. Or, given how there's no penalty for not sticking to the asphalt, you can also then exploit this in one of many areas, with one of the most infamous being the shortcut on Fuji Speedway, which pretty much guarantees you win the race every single time. And what do you get for winning these races? Well, money for starters, which as you can imagine you can use for buying new cars, buying upgrades to your existing cars, and well, not much else apart from that. But you also unlock new cars, and you unlock a lot of them. In fact, even though you can buy most of the cars you see, and as even as entire used car mechanic you can engage with, you really don't have to, because well, after you get given your first car for completing the first license course, you can pretty much just sustain yourself on unlocked cars after that, given how you get pretty much all of the different types you need to participate in all the different cup types. Now, apart from having car restrictions, there's also license restrictions. Yes, if the stress of getting a driver's license in real life wasn't enough, you have to do it all again in a game this time. It does a decent enough job about teaching you the basics of driving and the actual driving physics within the game. I wouldn't say it may be that much better of a driver in game though, given how it doesn't do a fantastic job of explaining many of its mechanics either. Sure, you usually get a blurb telling you what an exercise is about and how to do it, and you even get these previews of how they should be done, but they're also not the most useful things in the world, given how they don't show you what buttons are being pressed and when and in what order. And even just getting the bronze times can be extremely aggravating and will take you way too much time. And if you try to look for any help on these online, given the target audience of this kind of game, most of the time you just get the answer of skill issue. Sure, it got easier when I realized I can press down on the right joystick to bring up a driving line, but even that doesn't solve all the problems. Plus, it's also available on only the easier courses, not the more difficult ones where they'll come in the most helpful. And well, I did manage to make my way through them just by trial and error, and I definitely got a bit better at understanding how the physics of the game work. Issue is, given how pretty much every single car feels different to drive, it doesn't end up being as educational of an experience as they probably intended, or at least that's the case for me. Though it's still a fun enough little role-playing thing added into the game. But we're not done yet, because apart from all of that, there's also the driving missions. They're kind of like the license tests, but taken to a next level, and you have everything from more regular races but with some special rules thrown in, to being in a Nissan Cube racing against 5 other identically tuned Nissan Cubes and trying to win just by using drafting. Yep, it gets pretty wacky. But what if, in this driving game, you don't want to drive yourself? Well, that is where one of the most bizarre additions to GT4 comes in, and that is B-Spec mode, which allows you to take a back seat and watch all the action unfold with you just giving basic instructions. It's weird, to say the least, seeing how you have no control over the car, rather giving it very vague directions like allowing it to overtake, and also telling the driver how aggressive they should be. I know it's a whole genre of games where we don't really play them yourself, rather you just kind of control from the sidelines. However, this just doesn't have that kind of depth and complexity like those. More than anything, it's just a mode you can trigger whenever you can't be bothered to race yourself, so the AI does it for you. And you're gonna definitely need this mode for some of the longer events in this game, like the multi-hour races or even the 24-hour ones. Yes, there are events here where they expect you to drive for 24 hours straight. If you're dedicated enough to actually drive the whole time instead of just using the built-in B-Spec mode, good on you. I'm not, so I'm just gonna 3 times speed it and only interact with the game whenever a pit stop is due. And the cars. We have to talk about the cars. The game made plenty of headlines, given the fact it had over 700 cars, ranging from everything from the normal to the bizarre to the extremely bizarre. Yes, it is a car from 1886. Yes, it has less than 1 horsepower, and no, you can't actually race in it, though you can still test run it, even though you'll probably never reach a finish line in a human lifetime. And to make your head hurt, there's even concept cards released after this game came out, like the Night concept from 2022. But obviously, what is a car game without car customization? And there is some, but don't expect too much. Sure, whenever you buy a car, you can choose out what color you want. You can change out what wheels you have and maybe add a spoiler here or there. And of course, there's the performance customization. And while you have plenty of freedom in some areas, like for example, you can strap nitrous and a turbocharger to a car so flimsy that by all accounts, it should just disintegrate the second you press down on the pedal. However, it's pretty rare to find a car where most of the parts are even unlocked. So it becomes this annoying trial and error where you have to go into every single menu and see what you can actually customize or upgrade in any given car. I get that in some cars they are pre-tuned, and in some cars they literally wouldn't support given parts in a real scenario, but it's pretty annoying, especially because it doesn't give you an explanation why you can't install certain things. So again, all you have to do is just go into every single menu and see what you can and can't do for every single vehicle you have. And while you can further fine-tune the cars by playing with some extra settings a bit more, it is a pretty user-hostile thing unless you are already an expert and know what all of these things actually do. And while again they do give you a quick line here or there explaining what each thing does, it doesn't go further than that. What's more, it also lacks that on-the-go tuning that Need for Speed Underground 2 did in 2004, allowing you to better learn what each setting does and how it affects the car. Honestly, it's kind of a missed opportunity to have something along the same lines like the license tests or the driving missions, where the game explains what certain variables do by having you achieve some preset goal by just tuning the car. So while the car customization isn't as deep as some of the other games that were out at that time, the ability to show off your car, now this is where the game shines, given how you can both save video replays of the races as well as photos. And man, this photo mode. Apart from just having a huge amount of locations to choose from, you can get crazy involved, adjusting every little detail of the frame until you get the perfect shot. You can really go all out with this kind of photography here, and once you're done, you can export them to either an external USB, so you can move it over to your PC, or even print directly from a console. Yes, that's a thing, and yes, I recently tried to do it over on the Other Runner channel, so definitely check that out. Unfortunately, while you can export the photos, the videos and replays from the races you can't, because they aren't your typical video files. They are these all-encompassing replays of everything that happened in a given race that you can live edit and change on the go. So if you wanted to get those off the console so you can upload them to the YouTube that didn't even exist yet, well, you probably just had to use some kind of capture device. And all of that stuff is what made Gran Turismo 4 so special. The depth, all of that on a pretty decent but now 4-year-old console. And sure, graphically it's definitely not some kind of golden standard. It does look alright, however, especially on newer TVs, the image does look rather grainy, not to mention the lighting being extremely flat, apart from maybe some cheap god rays in the forest here or there, or all of the bright lights and neons in Hong Kong, for example, which sure do add some variety to the lighting, but otherwise it's pretty plainly lit. But again, the graphics is not what the game was about. It was just about the depth, the realism, the variety, but also to me, its very specific tone. You see, even though I say I like racing games, more specifically I just like 2 racing game franchises, Need for Speed and then also Gran Turismo, even though I only played Gran Turismo 4. And sure, it may be weird to pair those two together in literally any way, but they are very much in the same bucket of racing games that don't bore me to death. My problem with a lot of racing games is that they take themselves too seriously, or they have not enough going on apart from just the racing to make them worthwhile for me. I don't care that the driving physics in Need for Speed may not be as advanced as in Gran Turismo, or like in some of those super sophisticated driving games where people get mad at you if you call them a game at all and not a driving sim. What I care about is having a fun and engaging driving game where there is more to it than it just being, well, about driving. And obviously Gran Turismo 4 doesn't have the same kind of tone, atmosphere, or more edgy aesthetic of, say, Underground or Underground 2. It still has its unique charm and tone going on that is at least more than what a lot of other racing games can say. It's that very Japanese tone, you know what I'm talking about? One where it is super serious on the surface, but still goes in some really bizarre directions while still keeping a straight face for all of it. Being given ridiculous cars as prizes and just the obscene depth and detail it goes in is just part of it. What also really makes it special is the music. I mean, just get a load of what music plays in this super serious racing sim when you go to get your car washed, for example. Or when you fail one of the license tests, would you expect this music to start playing of all things? At the end of the day, it's a game that kind of doesn't take itself too seriously. Speaking of, the music all around is absolutely amazing. All of the original menu tracks are iconic in their own right and have just the perfect chill vibe when you're just browsing cars or just purchasing some upgrades. And as you can expect from a game with this particular tone, the race music is really all over the place, with pretty much every single possible genre being represented here. Though I was kind of disappointed that it is kind of limited, that is until I discovered that the game has a lot more songs, they just aren't selected by default to be played in races for some reason. So just make sure you go into the jukebox and actually select all of them to play during the races. But really, the variety here is amazing. You get everything from Franz Ferdinand, will.i.am to Judas Priest. And it's all of these things combined that make Gran Turismo 4 so special. Just the fact it features more content in many racing games now is a big selling point in itself, but it's also how it presents itself that really seals the deal, and what elevates it from just being a boring old racing sim. Despite how deep it all goes, there is that level of polish and thought behind literally everything. Well, okay, there are some issues here or there, like I already mentioned, but when you're dealing with a game so big, it is to be expected. Gran Turismo 4 is one of those things that really makes me question physics, because I cannot understand how a game so big can fit on just this old DVD, and you can play it on something with less processing power than a modern smartwatch. Now, unfortunately, if you want to play it yourself, like many racing games within a time period with licensed soundtracks, it hasn't been re-released and probably never will because of those licensing issues, which is a shame, but thankfully you can still get it for relatively cheap secondhand, so you really don't have much of an excuse to not give it a go. Though if you are hunting for copies of it, you may also run across this, the Gran Turismo 4 Prologue, which is essentially a kind of demo disc that was released beforehand to give people a taste of what a full thing would be like. Then there's also this thing, the Gran Turismo 4 Press Edition, which I covered on this channel before. Basically, it's a special copy given to reviewers at a time, which features the main game, a disc of promotional materials, and a bunch of other goodies. So again, check out the whole video if you want to learn more. Though good luck getting one at a reasonable price, because those things are pretty expensive, and getting even more so. Though of course none of that can beat one of the most expensive editions of the game, the Japanese Nike edition. Well, okay, there's also the special PS2 online demo discs, but good luck even seeing them listed anywhere. So if for whatever reason you haven't played it yet, go give it a shot, and then lose hundreds of hours of your life as you're determined to beat every single race, unlock every single car, as more and more just keep coming. It's a game that almost never ends, and honestly we'll still probably be playing it for another 20 years, or until a better Gran Turismo game comes out, so probably in about 20 years time. And as usual, check out the Patreon page, so I can hopefully one day finally afford a Nike edition.